Hey everyone, it's Brett Hornby here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And I know one of my Calgary sports content that I talk about is the CFL and the Calgary Stampeders. However, with the combination of this being traditionally the off-season and the fact that didn't have a season at all during the 2020 season due to the global pandemic with COVID-19, it's definitely been the longest off-season of all time when it comes to the Canadian Football League. But this is the time of year that we'll take a look at the first few days of the CFL free agency, talk about the players that were out to be free agents for the Calgary Stampeders, and then we'll take a look at around the league on player movements. And especially this offseason, there was already some player movement that happened ahead of free agent frenzy. I know that this is the second season that the CFL had like a courting period where a week ahead of free agent frenzy that you can talk to potential free agents before the actual date. And I know this year in particular, there was definitely some quarterbacks that changed teams where technically you could say they never actually played for the team because the 2020 season never actually happened. Immediate names that come to my mind, well, remember when Calgary traded Nick Arbuckle to the Ottawa Red Blacks? Well, the Ottawa Red Blacks actually moved on from Nick Arbuckle. Well, now he is going to the Toronto Argonauts, and that was ahead of the free agent frenzy. I know that February 1st is generally the date where players or teams usually release players because they're due performance bonuses. But then Toronto was looking to have Matt Nichols lead the way for this 2020 season. It never happened. So he got released. And Matt Nichols, as you recall, used to play mostly with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. He was a part of the team that was on the Grey Cup winning team that he never played a role in it because eventually Zach Collaros eventually came to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Well, essentially you could say Nick Arbuckle and Matt Nichols have switched sides in Ontario because Matt Nichols is now the quarterback for the Ottawa Red Blacks, assuming we have a season in 2021. And then I think the Toronto Argonauts, they definitely have been loaded up, because as a Stampeder fan, I'm familiar with Charleston Hughes, the sackmaster. Well, a couple of years ago, we moved on from him, where we traded him to Hamilton for a draft pick, but then Hamilton wound up flipping him to Saskatchewan. So he spent the last few seasons in Saskatchewan. Well, he got released, and some teams especially have been trying to restructure contracts, especially with salaries being, uncertain right now with the CFL. Well, Charleston Hughes is actually going to the Toronto Argonauts, and then there's another big trade that the Calgary Stampeders made with the Toronto Argonauts, which is essentially players that were big impact players for the Calgary Stampeders. As we traded Robertson Daniel, we also traded Cordero Law and Eric Rogers. They were all going to the Toronto Argonauts, at least their negotiating rates, and we got a couple draft picks in return in the Canadian College Draft. There was word that the Calgary Stampeders were looking to re-sign them anyway. Well, as of this recording, I know that I think it was Cordero Law and wide receiver Eric Rogers did sign the Toronto Argonauts. So that's the other pending unrestricted free agents, and that was some business that was done ahead of the free agent frenzy. Given the history of John Hufnagel since he's taken over and being a general manager of the Calgary Stampeders, we're a team that generally does a lot of our business before free agent frenzy and not make any big names, and that's definitely going to be the case for this offseason as well. But there was definitely some player movements I'll get to. So the pending restricted free agents or unrestricted free agents that the Calgary Stampeders had going into the 2021 season, well, we were able to get Marquis Adams signed before the free agent frenzy. He was signed just before the new year. However, we actually got a couple of retired players, most notably Shane Bergman on the offensive line. He actually decided to retire just before free agent frenzy, as well as David Brown, the offensive line. They're both national players as well, so that's definitely going to have to replenish that in the draft or somewhere else to bring in the offensive line. Then another player that actually decided to move closer to home is the long snapper Pierre-Luc Caron. He actually went to college in Laval Well, he moved to Montreal in the offseason, especially with the season that didn't happen. He actually wound up signing with the Montreal Alouettes. So I think Aaron Cameron, I think if I said the name right, we signed a new long snapper ahead of free agent frenzy. So we were able to replenish that position for the special teams. But we're going to have a new look special teams assuming we have a season, because if you remember the end of the 2019 season, Rob Mabert retired, so we're going to have a new punter that technically re-signed, but he signed last season for the season that didn't happen. Also going down to the pending restricted free agent, Monzel Cozart, who looked upon maybe being the backup quarterback behind Bo Levi Mitchell. He's still available. He hasn't signed anywhere yet. And as I already mentioned, Robert Sendani, well, we traded his rights to the Toronto Argonauts, and I think, as I know, he has not signed anywhere as of this recording. And then we have Deshaun Downey, a defensive lineman from Massachusetts. He's still available. And then we were able to re-sign Brendan Dozer, defensive back, just before free agent frenzy at the beginning of February. And then another offensive lineman that was a big part of our whole line that has retired and is a national from Simon Fraser University is Brad Erdos. So our offensive line, if we have football in 2021, is going to look a heck of a lot different. And then we have fullback Savon Greengrass Gangnam, who is from Bethel. Well, he's still available as is a recording as a free agent. However, we definitely got a lot of other, in-house business done, including receiver Colton Hunchuk, who is a national. We were able to extend him just after the new year, and I would say Colton Hunchuk has been a nice draft pick that the Calgary Stampeders made a couple years ago, and maybe he's someone that could be someone that can take a bigger role. I'm always going to keep saying assuming we have football this season. And then we had defensive back Lorenzo Jerome, who has played in the CFL last few years. I know that in the 2019 season we last actually played, he spent most of the season hurt. Well, actually he's going to the Saskatchewan Roughriders, so we weren't able to re-sign him, and he signed with Saskatchewan. Actually, we released him. Actually, no, February 9th was the date when it opened, so he has a day one free agent frenzy. So he's going to Saskatchewan. Another offensive lineman that I'm intrigued that if he actually gets to play, he spent most of the time with the practice roster, is Leo Johnson. We actually were able to extend him in January just after the New Year, so he is back with the Calgary Stampeders. Riley Jones, he is still available, linebacker that mostly played on special teams. I have a little more of a connection, or not personally, but I would say I have more of a liking with Riley Jones, because when I went to the Grey Cup in Edmonton, the 106 Grey Cup, I happened to realize I sat behind the family of Riley Jones, and he made one of the biggest tackles, and that created the turnover, I remember, in the fourth quarter. So hopefully we can keep Riley Jones. He is a national linebacker, UNBC products, so hopefully we keep him back, but he's still available as of this recording. And then Kamar Jordan, well, he spent most of the 2019 season on the injured list, and he's looked upon right now, you could say, be one of the top receivers in the CFL, and at least for the Calgary Stampeders. We were able to extend him in January, so we'll see if he actually comes back for his injury. Well, the fact we didn't play last season, or neither in the CFL, he should be fully 100%. At least when it comes to the offensive line, although he's an import or an American offensive line from Oklahoma, Neil Cascati, we were able to at least get him extended in January as well. So at least we have a veteran back in the offensive line. And then Mccloud, the wide receiver, well, he's still available as he's recording. The big question for Calgary is who's going to be our running back this season. I think that was definitely a sore spot for the Calgary Stampeders back in 2019, where I'd say we've been spoiled with John Cornish for over the years, and then we had Jerome Messam, and then we had bouts with Don Jackson. I think our running back position was a sore spot, but we had injuries with Kadeem Carey as well, with Romar Morris. Well, at least we got William Longley, a running back. He is coming back, and we signed him just before Christmas. And then Cordell Law, as I already mentioned, we traded his rights to the Toronto Argonauts ahead of the beginning of the courting period, which was the end of January. And he did actually sign with the Toronto Argonauts before the official start of free agent frenzy. And I'm going to say the Toronto Argonauts, I would say, is going to be looking a lot different. I'm going to look a lot better on paper if we actually do play. And then another player that I think was one of our biggest free agent signings from last season before, everything shut down and what happened, Richard Leonard. So we are able to extend him this for Christmas. He hasn't made an impact yet with the Calgary Stampeders because of we didn't play last season, but I'm going to say he was one of the biggest signings that we made in the offseason, last season for Agent Frenzy. And actually, Wynton McManus, he actually opted out, and I know that he was trying his luck with the NFL. He has been bouncing around, but I'm not too sure if we're going to get Wynton McManus back, one of our top linebackers from a few seasons ago. And then defensive back from Guelph, we were able to re-sign Royce Metchie, who has been, remember, he made an impact in the secondary a couple seasons ago, so it's nice to have him back. And then we have a couple linebackers that are still available. One is Eric Maraziola, who we drafted a couple seasons ago. He's still available, as well as Chase Middleton. So these are a couple players that are still available as of this recording. They have not signed with Calgary, but they haven't signed anywhere else yet. And then we extended Jonathan Moxey, defensive back, just before the new year, as well as Lauren Olamondi, defensive back, lineman, headed for Christmas as well. Hopefully he can rebound from his injury that he suffered during the 2019 season. And then, of course, one of our big key players that are still around the Calgary Stampeders in Rennie Paredes, we extended him just ahead of free agent frenzy in the new year, so at least Rennie is back. And then one of our depth receivers that picked up last season, or the season before, I should say, season before, we're going to get mixed up because he never actually played in 2020. Aaron Peck has been extended just before the free agent frenzy, actually just before Christmas. But the player that's replacing Rob Maver, who we signed him last season because we knew Rob Maver retired after the 2019 season, was Ronald Pryfer, and we signed him actually a day after free agent frenzy began, so technically he hit the market. But we re-signed Ronnie Pryfer, but he also has not made an impact with the team just that because we never actually played. So at least we have Ronnie Pryfer in as the punter to replace Rob Maver. Well, another in-house player that we extended is Charlie Power, the running back who went to school in Saskatchewan. We signed him back in January. And then Dakota Prukop, who was one of the players that we picked up in free agent frenzy last season, who last played with the Toronto Argonauts. Well, he actually got extended for this upcoming season, so it's going to be interesting to see what's going to be the quarterback behind Bo Levi Mitchell. The fact that we moved on from Nick Arbuckle to hopefully he has an opportunity to be a starter, but Monsal Kozart is still available. And then when I get to who we actually signed, maybe we know the three quarterbacks we're going to go with for this upcoming season, of course, if we have a season. And then we also released, and he actually signed with Toronto. So the Toronto Argonauts, you could say, are going to have a lot of former Calgary Stampeders. Kind of like the Calgary Flames, where we signed a lot of former Vancouver Canucks. Well, we released Enzo Robo, who was a running back, actually ahead of free agent frenzy. And then he wound up signing with Toronto ahead of free agent frenzy, because once you're released, you're technically a free agent. And same with Eric Rogers. He did sign with the Toronto Argonauts, so it'll be interesting to see how he's going to work out there. And keep in mind that the Toronto Argonauts, well, they have going to have Nick Arbuckle coming in for this season, and Ryan Dinwiddie is the head coach. Well, as you recall, Ryan Dinwiddie was the quarterback's coach for the Calgary Stampeders, so there is some familiarity there for those players. And then we signed wide receiver Andres Saldago, which is one of the global players that we picked up a couple seasons ago from Mexico. So we'll see if he can play a bigger role for the Calgary Stampeders. As well as we kept one of our offensive linemen in Ryan Sevier, who went to school right here in Calgary and was a rookie on the 2018 season. So at least we are still keeping some offensive linemen, but I think it's obvious that unless we have some other players within the organization, and then keep in mind the 2020 draft class as well, that hopefully we're going to need to reload on the offensive line, in my mind, for next season. And then we still have Sterling Sheffield, who don't remember him making much of an impact at defensive end. Well, he's still a free agent and still available for anyone. And then again to the last few players for the Calgary Stampeders that we have either locked up or or actually we have signed them all to extensions, is Richard Sendani, the wide receiver. I'm going to say he's been one of the nice pickups that Calgary's had for a depth receiver. He is back. I think he actually is from Calgary. He went to school in Regina. We extended him, as well as Fraser Sopik, a linebacker from Western University. So he is back. And then two other big defensive backs that are great that we're going to have back with the Calgary Stampeders is Jamar Wall and Raheem Wilson is coming back. So those are all the pending free agents that the Calgary Stampeders had. Those are our statuses about 4 days after when free agent frenzy opens. So now if we look at the CFL website, let's talk about some free agents that are still available. And actually they don't list any current Stampeders that are still available. Well, Cameron Judge, he is still available for a linebacker for anyone. I know that he last played with the Saskatchewan Roughriders in the 2019 season with 61 tackles and 5 sacks and 2 interceptions, 1 for a touchdown. But could Cameron Judge, could that be a player that we could consider picking up since we moved on with a few players on the defensive line? And then there's Yunk Yamba, who recently, he's a Canadian. I know that he played with the Montreal Alouettes. Yeah, I believe, yeah. Yunk Yamba, there's 2 Wambas that played in the CFL. They're both brothers, so he is still available. And then Mccloud Bethel Thompson, who is most recently, he's only played his CFL career with the Toronto Argonauts, but he is still looking at his options for playing in the NFL. But I guess if someone has a backup quarterback that they want to add to their team, maybe Mccloud Bethel Thompson, or maybe he could be going back to the Toronto Argonauts. Well, here's another intriguing player is Justin Medlock, who recently played with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and we saw a lot of him at the 107 Grey Cup with all the field goals he made. Although there is speculation he is actually leaning towards retiring than actually playing more football. And then there's Matt O'Donnell, who's one of the tallest offensive linemen. I believe he actually did resign with the Edmonton Eskimos. Don't quote me on that, but they list him as one of the best available. But he is the tallest player in the league at 6'11" and 350 pounds. So he's definitely be coveted for anyone if he is still actually available. And then you got Justin Tuggle, who I actually believe he recently signed with the. Well, I know he did sign with the Edmonton football team, and I made a video talking about the proposed names on what they could say. It used to be called the Edmonton Eskimos, but I should have said I like the name Empire as well, but that's not considered, and that might cause controversy. But Justin Tuggle's available. And then you got Taylor Loeffler, who most recently played with the Montreal Alouettes. He's a national player, defensive back. And then they mentioned Alex Bazzi, who also recently played with Edmonton defensive line, and then Enrico Murray, a linebacker, who most recently played with I know he played for Toronto, played for Ottawa, and then he also played for the Ottawa Red Blacks and the Hamilton Tiger Cats. So that's what I meant to say. So there's a few players that are available that they list, but the thing is, it's just the fact that we didn't have a season last season, so this is a lot more cloudier free agent frenzy, I would say. And I'd say the fact that we didn't have a season last season, as a CFL fan, I'm always excited for transactions, but I am, only tentatively excited at best, just because we don't know what's going to happen this upcoming season. So the last part of this video, let's just take a look at the sudden impact of players that are, changing places everywhere. Well, the BC Lions, they brought back a few players. That's going to be interesting what they're going to make up to be. I know last season in 2019 when they actually played, the BC Lions were 5th in the West Division, and the fact that they struggled within their own division. If you go back to looking at my Calgary Stampeders this month when I recapped the games, I declared the BC Lions they were done by August because they already lost a lot of ground and lost the season series against basically all the Western teams. However, I'm going to like the players that they picked up. They got Shaq Cooper, who most recently played with Edmonton for running back, and I have seen Shaq Cooper at the potential they can provide to any offense, so he is going to the BC Lions from Edmonton. And then Lucky Whitehead, the wide receiver, most recently played with Winnipeg, he is going to BC. And then Chris Rainey, one of the top returners in the CFL. Well, he actually did start his career I understand, with the BC Lions. And he most recently played with Toronto. He is coming back to BC, so he's familiar. Players that are going elsewhere, that was with the BC Lions in 2019. Well, Jonathan White, he is going to Toronto. And then Jordan Herdman, one of the linebackers, he is actually going to Saskatchewan. And then Micah Johnson, who formerly played with the Calgary Stampeders one time, he is actually going, and he was supposed to play for Saskatchewan. He's going back to Saskatchewan. And Odell Willis, I'm going to say, we actually had him first in his rookie season back in 2009. Well, Odell Willis, he is still playing, and he also spent some time in Winnipeg, remember being the mayor of Swaggerville, and he made an impact with the Edmonton Eskimos. Well, he's going to Toronto. So the Toronto Argonauts, they're definitely going to have a lot of veterans for this upcoming season. I'm going to say they might be one of the more improved teams on paper right now, but I also think the Hamilton Tiger Cats, I'm going to say, are still looking good to be able to get back to the Grey Cup and potentially win it. And the Grey Cup's in Hamilton for this upcoming season. Of course, I got to say, assuming we have a season, but that's just a quick look at the BC Lions and the players that they added and the players that they lost in free frenzy. Well, the Calgary Stampeders, well, when I mentioned that we were wondering who were going to be the quarterbacks behind Bo Levi Mitchell, and the fact that we did sign Dakota Prukop, we have not signed Moncel Cozart. Well, actually, the Calgary Stampeders signed another former quarterback who used to be with the Toronto Argonauts, and he actually is a Canadian, in Michael O'Connor. So the Calgary Stampeders added Michael O'Connor from the Toronto Argonauts. So I'm going to think right now, unless we keep Moncel Cozart on the practice or have four quarterbacks, I think Bo is obviously the starter, which that's the no-brainer, one of the top quarterbacks in the league in the CFL. And then it's going to be between Dakota Prukop and Michael O'Connor. So that's likely going to be the three quarterbacks, at least that are signed. And then they mentioned that Ronnie Pfeiffer, who hit the market, but we were able to re-sign him, which is a good thing because there's not many punters that you can find that are available that could potentially make an impact for the Calgary Stampeders. And I mean, last season, Ronnie Pfeiffer is definitely a step below from Rob Maver, but he was the best punter that was available for the Calgary Stampeders. So those are the only two additions that the Calgary Stampeders were able to make. I also just remember another player that was actually punter and retire that actually is coming back. Maybe the fact that he had a season off might rejuvenate him, is Corey Greenwood. So Calgary Stampeders were able to get him. And I already mentioned a couple of the departures there I highlighted was Lorenzo Jerome, the defensive back. Well, he's going to Saskatchewan. And then the long snapper is Pierre-Luc Caron, who decided to stay home, close to the family, spend more time with family. He is now with the Montreal Alouettes, though I know he signed I think it's Aaron Coleman. I know his first name is Aaron. He used to play with the Hamilton Tiger Cats. He's the long snapper that we brought in to replace Pierre-Luc Caron. So now if you look at the Edmonton football team, I almost have to bite my tongue and say they're not the Eskimos anymore and don't know what we're going to call them. You can see that video that I recently made where I ranked the 7 proposed names of who I think they should go with. But Edmonton, in the meantime, well, they actually added James Wilder Jr., who is one of the top running backs in the CFL. Most recently, well, he did start his career with the Toronto Argonauts, and then he never actually played with the Montreal Alouettes because last season didn't happen. He is going to Edmonton, and then they signed Taylor Cornelius, who I think he wasn't associated with any team, the quarterback, and then linebacker Kevin Brown, who most recently played with the Ottawa Red Blacks, or had the rights of the Ottawa Red Blacks. I almost have to say both, because if you signed with a team last season but never actually played, you still had your rights with them. And then who left Edmonton? Well, I already mentioned Zach Cooper is going to the BC Lions, and then Nick Gusher, the defensive lineman, he is going to the Montreal Alouettes. Then he had a different defensive back, Godfrey Onera, who signed with the Saskatchewan Roughriders, and then the defensive lineman Stephen Charles going to Ottawa. I know that the Edmonton football team, they also signed former Calgary Stampeder Derek Dennis, so he is joining the Edmonton Eskimos. He did not sign anywhere this past season, but he is going up to Edmonton. So now if you look at the Saskatchewan Roughriders, they definitely added a lot of players and kept some assets. I know one big loss that the Saskatchewan Roughriders have is defenseman lineman Solomon Eliminian, who also played with the BC Lions. He has decided to retire, but you got offensive lineman Evan Johnson, who was most recently with the Ottawa Red Blacks, going to Saskatchewan. And then Jordan Herdman Reed, Justin Herdman Reed and Jordan Herdman are actually brothers. Justin Herdman Reed, most recently was with Hamilton, and Jordan Herdman, most recently BC. They're now with the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And then I already mentioned Godfrey Ardea, defensive back who used to play with Edmonton, now Saskatchewan. Then Michael Johnson, who's going back to Saskatchewan. And then Larry Dean, the linebacker, is a big signing from Hamilton. He is going to Saskatchewan. And then they decided to keep John Ryan. That was the other potential option if Calgary didn't get to keep Ronnie Pfeiffer. But John Ryan was set, and he is actually from the Saskatchewan area. You might remember him. He started his career in the CFL with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and then he recently played in the NFL with the Seattle Seahawks before coming back to the CFL. And then they mentioned the only departure for Saskatchewan is linebacker Alexandre Chevrier, who I can assume he is from Quebec, close to home. He did sign with the Montreal Alouettes. So when it comes to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, it's a much shorter list compared to the Saskatchewan Roughriders on who they added. Because I think the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, they definitely did a lot of in-house, keep all their top players while they are the defending Grey Cup champions. I guess the joke is that the Winnipeg Blue Bombers waited so long to get the Grey Cup after they first won it. Well, they won it in 1990 and then eventually they finally won it in 2019. So I guess they keep the title for an extra long time. They actually signed lawn snapper Mike Benson. I guess now they got Peter Caron, so he was available. He is going to Winnipeg from Montreal, and then they kept wide receiver Brian Mitchell, or they added Brian Mitchell from, I believe, the NFL. So that's is who's coming to Winnipeg. Who's leaving Winnipeg? Well, I mentioned Lucky Whitehead, the wide receiver, going to BC. And you got Emmanuel Yaxini, who defensive back. He is signed with the Montreal Alouettes. And then wide receiver Daniel Peterman, one of their depth receivers, he is signed with Ottawa. So that's the Winnipeg side of the story. And then the finalists for the Grey Cup last season, Hamilton Ticats, they also kept a lot of their players, including Jeremiah Masoli and Dane Evans. They also added a couple solid players. Well, they got Ciante Evans, the former Stampeder defensive back who spent a few seasons with the Montreal Alouettes. He is going to Hamilton. And then they signed wide receiver Brian Jones, Byron Marshall, running back Malik Carty, defensive lineman, and Patrick Nelson. Don't mention former teams who is going to the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Leaving the Hamilton Tiger Cats, well, Patrick Levels, who also recently, he was formerly Calgary Stampeder. Actually, he's going back to Montreal. And then Justin Herdman Reed going to Saskatchewan as Larry Dean going to Saskatchewan. So they're able to plug up some holes that they lost in free agent frenzy. Montreal Alouettes, they definitely have added a lot of in free agent frenzy. They got Lamando Seawell, defensive lineman, who used to play with Edmonton. And then I mentioned they got Patrick Levels, who was with the Hamilton Tiger Cats, Easter Rights. And then Nick Usher from Edmonton. Then they got linebacker Chris Aki from Toronto. And then they got defensive lineman Michael Wakefield from Ottawa. And then they added Woody Barron. And then Pierre Tuclan Perron from Calgary. And then the Alexander Chevrier from Saskatchewan. Then there's Rebus Savasu, if I said the name right. He actually was with the Toronto Argonauts. Then Kiefer Emmanuel from Winnipeg. Then Jason Luzon Seguin, who's an offensive lineman. He was with the Ottawa Red Blacks, now going to Montreal. Then Nate Jay, who I remember he used to play with Edmonton, has rights with the Toronto Argonauts. He's going to Montreal. And then there's a Prince Smith, the defensive lineman. And then we're defensive back and Chris Robeson, quarterback. So that's, I'm going to say the East Division. I mean, the last few seasons, the West has been a lot stronger. I'm going to say the East Division is getting a lot stronger, just looking at free agent frenzy. And assuming we play a full season in 2021, regardless however they pull it off, and the fact that there is more interdivisional play, I'm going to say there will be no crossover in 2021. So the players that are leaving Montreal, well, James Waller Jr. going to Edmonton, and Antonio Pipkin, who I'm going to say behind Vernon Adams Jr., Antonio Pipkin has definitely had a few flashes in the pan with Montreal. I know that they struggled to find that guy after Anthony Calvillo, a stud quarterback, and Vaz, to quote Milt Stegall, Vernon Adams Jr. is definitely the number one quarterback for the Montreal West. Well, Antonio Pipkin is actually going to Toronto. And then Ciante Evans to Hamilton, and then Mike Benson, the long snapper, going to Winnipeg. So the Montreal Alouettes, I'm going to say they definitely reloaded in free agent frenzy, just like the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Now, I started a list for the Ottawa Red Blacks. Well, Don Awamba, who they added, and Stephen Charles, the defensive lineman. I know Don Awamba, I think he most recently played with the Hamilton Tiger Cats, and then Stephen Charles, who used to be with Edmonton. Leaving Ottawa, well, you got offensive lineman Evan Johnson going to Saskatchewan, and then Jason Lauzon Sewin, offensive lineman going to Montreal. And then the Toronto Argonauts, I mean, they definitely loaded up. I mean, they got a couple former Stampeders from that trade, and Eric Rogers, as well as Cordell Law, and they also got Charleston Hughes. And then they, with the releasing of Matt Nichols and Ottawa releasing Nick Arbuckle, well, now they got Nick Arbuckle, but here are all the players that the Toronto Argonauts have signed, and they're going to be a very veteran-laden team if we play this upcoming season. Well, they got Jonathan White, who recently was with the BC Lions, and then they got Tony Pitkin from Montreal. And then they also signed another quarterback in Kelly Bryant, and then Odell Willis, a longtime veteran. He is going to the Toronto Argonauts from BC, and then they have wide receiver Kendall Wright, linebacker Jonathan Moore, defensive line Fabian Foote, and then Jeremy Davis, wide receiver, and then Dwayne Harris, defensive lineman. And they don't list the most recent teams on the Toronto Argonauts. The only players that are leaving that's notable for the Toronto Argonauts, well, I already mentioned Michael Connor is going to my Calgary Stampeders, and then Sarajus Habasu and Nataya J, both wide receivers, going to Montreal. So that's just my quick overview of the CFL free agent frenzy, both who was going to hit the market for the Calgary Stampeders and looking around the league on players that are moving. I'm going to say more of the headline moves would have been ahead of free agent frenzy with the week before with the courting period. I mean, the Calgary Stampeders trading, Cordell Law, Eric Rogers, and then Robertson Daniels rights to the Toronto Argonauts. I believe we get a 4th round pick and the 3rd round pick in the global draft. I know when it's draft time, which is usually around May, I'll recap the draft, what the Calgary Stampeders did with those picks that we did acquire from the Toronto Argonauts. Basically, this is a case of we knew these players weren't likely going to come back to the Calgary Stampeders and fitting in the salary cap. So at least it was able to say, hey, Toronto, you're interested in these players. Would you mind giving us a couple draft picks and you can have the rights to them? So at least you got something out of nothing in that trade. But I think when it comes to the free agent frenzy, I'm going to say the Winnipeg Blue Bombers have basically did a lot of their off-season business ahead of free agent frenzy. Kind of just like what John Hufnagel usually does with the Calgary Stampeders. But I think when it comes to looking at free agent frenzy, I think the Toronto Argonauts on paper definitely loaded up. They got a lot of proven veterans. I think the Hamilton Tiger Cats, they have maintained their team and reloaded, and hopefully they can get back to the big game and be on the right end of the Grey Cup. The Grey Cup is scheduled to be in Hamilton for this upcoming season. It's hard to keep saying again, assuming we have a season, or we don't know about fans being in attendance. There might be some future CFL update videos in the future looking at what's going to happen to the league. But I think the Calgary Stampeders, I'm going to say we're bound to eventually slowly decline. I mean, we have been one of the top teams in the 2010s, and we were able to at least get a couple Grey Cups in 2014 and 2018. Unfortunately, we were on the wrong end of it in 2012 and in 2016 and 2017, 16 and 17 in more heartbreaking fashion. But I say as long as Calgary has Bo, and it all depends, any other players that we might pick up from other free agents in the NFL or somewhere else other than the CFL. But I think Calgary Stampeders should be competitive as long as you have Bo, but I think we're going to decline a little. But I think the talent I think the West overall, I think is bound to get a little weaker, and then the East is looking like it's getting a little stronger. But the last, several years, the West was so much better than the East that there was always been a crossover team. I think now with more interdivisional play, as I already broke down the schedule for the Calgary Stampeders in previous videos, I think there's going to be no crossover for this upcoming season, assuming we play a whole season. So that's basically all I have for any Calgary Stampeders news and CFL free agent frenzy. A few days after when it opened, it's not quite the same as NHL free agent frenzy, but just try to pump out some CFL content as a Calgary sports fan, that I am a Calgary Stampeders fan, it's still up in the air on if I'm actually going to go to any games this year or if I'm allowed to actually go to games. So anyway, I'll close out and say if you want to follow along this Calgary sports fan's journey, home to Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, I mostly do talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel. This is definitely one of the videos later to recap stories or games. I know for Calgary Stampeders, I did my Calgary Stampeders this month where I recap games each month during the season. Hopefully we'll have football, live football that actually happens in 2021. But I also do a variety of non-sports content. Let's say in-person vlogs, attempt to call me, and also do share my experience when I'm on the road or at a sporting event. Let's say if I'm at a football game. So if that all sounds like it'd be interesting to watch, to follow along this Calgary sports fan's journey, you know what you need to do, just make sure you like, subscribe. I also have my other social media links down in the description below. So I'm going to say go Stamps go, and hopefully we'll have some actual live CFL football to actually talk about games and all these players that are finding new places or staying where they are actually get to do their thing. So I'm going to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.